All right, good Friday to you. I'm Fox 35 Storm Team Chief Meteorologist Jamie King, Fox 35 Storm Center. Here to talk about the tropics, and boy, is it ever active right now. The latest tropical outlook featuring two distant waves now we're watching for tropical development. This is actually the remains of Emily. Remember yesterday, it was flashing bright red, had a very high chance of further development. That's down now to 30%. Doesn't mean anything to anyone really. I mean, that should stay out over the open Atlantic heading northbound and probably succumb to the cold water temperatures there in the distant North Atlantic. Down below that, we've got over the next 7 days a 50% chance here for development with this orange zone. That's staying to the east of Bermuda, well east of Bermuda, Bermuda right there. Concern for Bermuda is with Tropical Storm Franklin, which is going to gain some pretty substantial momentum. We're talking about a Category 1 hurricane here in pretty quick fashion, likely maybe sometime this weekend. And then beyond that, we'll advance from a Cat 1 to a Cat 2. That 2 staying out to sea a little bit longer term. I'll have the full track on that in a second. And lastly, we must address what's happening now around the shoreline there in Honduras and Central America, south of the Yucatan, as that area now has a fairly high chance of developing over the next 7 days at 70%. The 2-day outlook on that, courtesy of NHC, at 30% chance of developing. So lots to talk about. We told you the lid was going to come off, right? We got super hot ocean temperatures now and environments that can support further tropical development. So here's the latest on Franklin for you. Southeast movement now at 6. That should come back around more of a north and eventually tug to the north and east. Pressure now down, and of course winds at around 50 miles per hour. So we're going to start to see this thing ramping up about 2 o'clock on Sunday afternoon. Winds will begin to approach that 90 mile per hour mark, and then that's when we start to see the advancement of overall intensity with Franklin, upwards of a Cat 2 at 105 miles per hour. This is Bermuda right here. Little tiny speck on the map, a beautiful island, and boy, they hurricane harden on that island. They get whacked seemingly each and every year in some form or fashion with some type of tropical presence or entity breezing on by. Sometimes it's high overhead, right over the island. Other times it's from a distance with battering ocean swells and increasing pulses of wind. But on this track with Franklin, our concern here is that north-northeast movement is all the ocean swell that'll be shedding off of this. Think of it as dropping a pebble in a pond, right? You get that little ripple action spreading on out. Well, that's what's happening with Franklin as it moves northbound through the open Atlantic, roughing up the seas, big-time sea heights in excess of 20 or 25 feet here in the extended outlook. And all that ocean energy as it moves northbound over the open Atlantic, all that energy has got to go somewhere. So that begins to fan out, impacts the Bahama Islands, will impact us here in central Florida. For those of you maybe watching from elsewhere, are you in Hilton Head, South Carolina, maybe Charleston, to the Outer Banks of North Carolina, Kill Devil Hills and Nags Head? Beautiful territory, but boy, you guys get whacked every once in a blue moon. And also all the way up past Long Island toward coastal areas of the northeastern and New England states. It's a very far-reaching impact of Franklin, even if it doesn't touch land and there's no wind associated with it impacting land. It's all about that ocean swell. So this is the GFS forecast model looking at that ocean swell beginning to radiate out toward the Atlantic beaches here, certainly getting into the Bahamas. There's a look at Monday at 9 a.m. Look how juiced up these seas are with all that energy streamlining through the coastal waters and becoming rather impactful in terms of much higher surf. Great for experienced surfers. Not good, though, for the common guy who wants to just cool down in the Atlantic, because, boy, temps are going to be roasting hot all up and down the Atlantic seaboard in the coming days, especially here in central Florida. So rip currents will be on the minds of many. Best to just stay out of the water as waves continue to increase in intensity and overall frequency, breaching the weekend and going into next week. I want to address what's happening here over the next 7 days. The southern Gulf of Mexico down to the northwestern Caribbean. X marks the spot. This is Honduras down here in Central America. So what we're watching now is basically an area of disorganized weather, right? A big area of spin. That's very evident here. You can see that. A depression, maybe a storm possible as soon as late Sunday into Monday. So that's something we've got to keep top of mind as we go into the weekend. And of course, watching for impacts to us here in the Sunshine State of Florida Tuesday into Wednesday. So 70% now over the next 7 days. The 2-day outlook at about 30%. odds are this will develop into something, but what that something is remains to be seen. We're going to be tracking here for you all weekend long in the Fox 35 Storm Center. I want to give you a look at my exclusive Fox model. No other station in town has it, right? So it's one of the great things we do offer you here at Fox 35. And looking right now at the winds over the Caribbean, down through here, out through the southern Gulf of Mexico, over to western Cuba, and out toward the southeastern Gulf. I tell you, real tranquil conditions. Light ocean breezes for the most part. Seas generally at about 3 to 4 feet, or even less than that, a bit closer to the shoreline here in the west side of Florida. They're closer to Tampa. But the outlook now showing us that there may be something afoot here as we start to see some development as we go a little deeper into the weekend. You'll watch the winds here slowly starting to freshen up on the northern side of the Yucatan. So it looks like we're starting to see that cyclonic wrap becoming a little more defined, something we certainly have to be mindful of and watch as we go into the weekend. Watch the winds as they progress, as whatever this is ejects out of the Caribbean, crosses over the Yucatan. There's western Cuba with a pretty big uptick in winds there. Nothing yet by 9 a.m. Monday here across the Florida Peninsula, down and through the lower Keys, Key West and the Marathon. But time will tell on the exact movement on. There's a lot of uncertainty, nothing really for models to latch on solely here because we don't have a defined circulation yet. Not yet, right? That's the key word, yet. But we show you Monday here at 5 o'clock in the Fox model. Wind slowly starting to freshen up, and there's that circulation ejecting out through the southern Gulf. 46-mile-per-hour gusts there. It's tropical storm force. So we may have Idalia here, our next system, the I storm here on the 2023 Atlantic hurricane list. This is Tuesday at 3 o'clock. And then we see some advancements, potentially a strike here around maybe Tampa or slightly to the south there near Bradenton, Sarasota, in that general region of Florida. Wednesday at 1 a.m., you can see those winds pumping pretty hard. Now, anytime we have a system in the Gulf of Mexico, like the situation you see right here, all of us are on the eastern side here on the Florida Peninsula, right? So that in turn opens us up to areas of heavy rain, the gusty winds, a tornado or two, not out of the question. Thinking if this becomes a little bit more defined, think about those big arcing rain bands that'll be approaching on the southern flank of the circulation and riding up the gut of the state. Sometimes that can acquire rotation. Seemingly every time we have something in the Gulf in a similar position as it breezes on by or maybe enters the state out of the Gulf of Mexico, tornado-warned areas seemingly always begin to pop up. So we'll have to monitor for that too if this verifies, right? So looking again at 1 a.m. on Wednesday, look at all the colors. We'll match them up here. Definitely some tropical storm force. Could exceed that. I'm not saying we're going to get a hurricane in Florida, but we're entering the peak of season now. Sea surface temperatures are warm, and there may be some windows in the overall weather environment and the big picture as we draw closer to this getting near Florida that may allow it for further intensification. So that's one thing that we have to keep top of mind as we track this going late weekend into early next week. 3 a.m. on Wednesday, coastal winds, less friction over the open Atlantic would bring some pretty stout south and southeasterly winds along the Atlantic shoreline here of southern and central Florida, possibly up to as close as Jacksonville. You could see over the waters there, tropical storm force. And from there, theory is it would kick off the Atlantic side of the state of Florida and possibly hug along the Atlantic seaboard over the southeastern states. So we'll be tracking for that. In turn, the GFS forecast model, I've been studying this very closely this morning. We're not seeing a whole lot of development with the GFS. As we ramp up in the Monday, you can see what looks like could be that center of whatever this becomes. Does not look very well defined. The isobars or lines of equal pressure are not really tightly stacked like we saw at the Fox model and some other models that are weighing in on this. But it does look like a big rainmaker, whatever this turns into. It would become locally breezy, a lot of rain, which would actually be a good thing for the west side of Florida. I mean, we still got drought conditions in many areas. Heart of the rainy season now, and there's spots in west central Florida that haven't seen squat for days and weeks on end. So that would be of benefit, but then we talk about heavy rain and whatever this is as it's crossing the state, the potential for some meaningful wind gusts and the potential for areas to see a little bit of low-lying flooding as we look a bit longer term. That would blow out through late Wednesday through Thursday, and then we'll be back to normal business as we typically see here in central Florida during that time. Now, the GFS forecast model also, I want to show you the atmospheric moisture now as we see some drier air out ahead of this thing. That's going to keep our rain chances relatively low for the weekend locally here on top of Florida. But by Monday, and into Tuesday and Wednesday, there's that veil of moisture. So a little bit better here resolution in terms of how much rain we could actually experience here in Florida. And that's a lot of it, boy. You could see down through the Keys, Key West, to Marathon, the Largo, in through Miami-Dade, Broward County, and right on up the Pike to the Florida-Georgia line. That's some super soaked stuff here. On the back side of that, maybe we start to introduce briefly some drier air, and by the following Friday and into next weekend, Saturday, Sunday, we could see again another round of drier air on top. Now, as we look at the wind forecast concerning the GFS model, it does freshen up the winds. I'll give it that. You can see it here over the southwest side of the state as we close in here on our Monday. Got to get through Sunday first, still relatively light surface winds. Then we get into Monday, Monday afternoon, Monday evening, into the overnight Tuesday. Here comes that canopy of so much stronger winds there, moving up toward maybe Tampa. Some impactful winds starting to take shape. Looks like, again, we'll start to see that veil basically at around 30 plus miles per hour, encountering the southwest side of the state, becoming breezy along the Atlantic shoreline and for inland areas as well. That too begins to exit on out. Less friction over the water could bring some stronger winds into the northeastern coastal counties as we see the departure of whatever this system becomes. Now, as we look at the rain outlook, we don't see a whole lot here for the weekend locally. I've got coverage at less than 20% as we get to Saturday. Sunday comes up a little bit, and then more so with the approach of this tropical weather here into Wednesday. Doesn't look all that big and bad, right? We don't want to downplay it, but as I mentioned to you, nothing has formed yet. So the forecast models, all of them pretty much having a very tough time grappling on to whatever this might become, and then in turn what the impacts may ultimately be. So you can see here that the atmosphere begins to become a little super soaked, and we're talking about rain on the west side of the state breaching maybe the 2 to 3 inch mark. I bet you in the coming days, if we see a more formidable system developing, the potential there, that's when we start to talk about some higher rain as the modeling latches on to a final solution of sorts, right? Now, one thing that can foster an environment that will allow for some intensification here with this low as it kicks on out, sea surface temperatures from the west side of the Gulf of Mexico all the way out east of the Florida Peninsula. You can see that waters are plentifully warm. The usual mark in the sand, right, is like 79, 80 degrees Fahrenheit in the water temps, and we've far exceeded that. These are mid and upper 80s here throughout the spine of the Gulf of Mexico and the surrounding waters, shelf waters and offshore waters. Everything is pumped full with a lot of heat energy. One thing I noticed today in the modeling, and I want to share with you, once this thing kicks on out past the Yucatan, it looks like we may begin to see an upper level low develop in the northeastern Gulf by Sunday. That could have a huge, and I mean a huge bearing on whatever decides to spin up and develop, right? We increase the wind shear meaning winds in the upper levels of the atmosphere that sometimes, quite frankly, can work in opposition of anything tropical trying to develop, kind of tearing it apart, leaving it ragged or ill-defined. Not all that impactful. Could turn a system like I showed you on the GFS into a big old area of heavy tropical rains, and that would be the ball game, right? So we're going to be monitoring for that. I've seen this signal in the forecast models for a couple of days now. Right now on the wind shear modeling, it is designated as an unfavorable environment for further intensification into Sunday, but keeping in mind by Sunday and the Monday, we're just going to start pulling whatever feature that is out of the Northwest Caribbean into the Southern Gulf, and then it's game on. But what type of impact or bearing might that set up or low have? So Adelia, the next name storm on the list. We've had a couple of brushes here. Looks like we're going to update the Franklin situation probably to hurricane status. The one before that we know was Dawn. Dawn met its maker out over the North Atlantic. It was a very brief window of sustained hurricane intensity, and that was it. Now, we also factor in El Nino, right? Or the lack of factor in El Nino. Typically in an El Nino pattern, the Pacific is way more active than the Atlantic. Warmer waters here, but strong wind shear and those upper level winds I described to you, that makes for a very hostile environment to spin up anything tropical. Things have changed though. Might the sea surface temperatures that are so darn warm, record warm, be countering the impacts of El Nino, keeping us a little more chill, a little quieter here in the Atlantic? Looks like sea surface temperatures are winning on out. So we'll be monitoring for that as we approach the climatological peak on average September 10th, and we stay very active through the core of September, October, heck, even into November when season starts wrapping November 30th. I mean, we had back-to-back with Ian and Nicole just last season. Nicole, again, in November's system just before Thanksgiving, as we all know. So we're heading up the hill. More action expected. Not saying it's going to happen, but everyone needs to keep that top of mind and know there could be more storms and hurricanes forming this 2023 Atlantic hurricane season. So, friends, before I leave you, I want to update you on the 7-day forecast locally here in Central Florida at Fox 35, the Orlando area where I'm located, showing that we're watching the tropics. I'm going to increase the breezes here. Also, rain opportunities. We'll probably see highs kind of sandwich back down into the upper 80s, and you'll notice the overnight lows very tropical and steamy as well, right on through the 70s. That's our tropical update, live from the Fox 35 Storm Center here on the YouTube platform. Keep it here to Fox 35. Breathe easy. No imminent any kind of impacts or anything like that scheduled for the weekend. The weekend looking quite nice, as you can see, but further down the line, we'll be watching and we'll be tracking. That's all for now. I'm Fox 35 Storm Team Chief Meteorologist Jamie King. You have a great day. Keep it to Fox for the very latest.